So we've got lots and lots of questions here. Next up with a hand up is Andrew Damon. If Brian can turn him, give him a voice here. Go ahead, Andre. You're on mute.
Yes, thank you very much. I was waiting to be unmuted there. Thank you so much, Mr. Ellsberg, for your decades of courage and the warnings that you have made, both in your latest book, in your reporting on the discussions in the 1950s, and in your latest warnings. I have a lot of questions for you. I'll try to be brief and not take too much of your time. First off, today, I don't know if you've seen this, but the Wall Street Journal carries an editorial supporting what they call a bipartisan missile buildup. They hail the Biden administration for continuing Trump's expansion of US nuclear weapons. They write, quote, "A bipartisan consensus is forming that accepts and capitalizes on President Trump's 2019 exit from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty," end quote. What accounts for the seeming unanimity between the Democratic and Republican parties in preparing for a war that, as you have explained, could end human civilization? Just another question that I thought of as you were speaking. You cited the column by Thomas Friedman, who you called a smart fool. I'm just recall the observation by Leo Tolstoy. There are two types of fools. There's quiet ones and dangerous ones. Friedman is certainly the latter. But Friedman's column begins by noting the new book by Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis, 2034, a novel of the next world war. And they write, I don't know if you're familiar with the book itself, but they write as if they had not read your book, although I'm sure they're familiar with the contents of the doomsday machine that you've described. But they basically described a very sort of tit for tat, some US ships are sunk, and then San Diego is attacked and Shanghai's attacked. Oh, and then the war is over and life goes on as usual. It's as anyone who's read your book knows, this is completely absurd. But really, Friedman is certainly very well connected, and that's what makes him dangerous. He speaks and
Andre, if you could kind of pull it to a close, because we've got a limited time.
What is your response to those two points? Apologies for taking so much time.
On the first point, of course, the Wall Street Journal editorial page has been on the dark side, let's say, for a long time. And apparently they haven't changed much. But on this, they are pointing to a bipartisan policy. That's the worst of it. The truth is that the Democrats, I have friends and colleagues with whom I have a very deep disagreement in the last election and the one before it, where they felt the Democrats are so benighted and so bad that the Republicans, and specifically Trump, were not worse. And I thought of that as, it was a deep disagreement. I thought they were very, very wrong about that in thinking that a progressive could afford to vote, not vote at all between these two terrible parties, or vote for a third party. Even though I certainly agreed with the programs of the progressive third parties on that, but that I saw a great risk indeed in getting Trump, and I think that was justified. But on foreign policy, these friends of mine, were not particularly wrong. They pointed to that, and it's true. On support of the military-industrial complex, on another way of saying support for the so-called defense budget, almost none of which has to do with defense, we come down to it, but the military budget, the Democrats have been bidding against the Republicans, and both bidding against each other for a long time. And there isn't that much difference between them. And for example, President Obama was said actually personally to favor no first use and to consider going down to a relatively, to the Chinese level. Nobody called it that. To going down to 300 warheads. Nobody said, yeah, going down to China, but they just, no, an absurd idea. Anyway, he did not pursue that in the way that his Nobel Prize winning speech in Prague suggested that he should be willing, an earnest commitment to reducing the risk of nuclear war. And he just didn't show that, unfortunately. So, and Biden doesn't. And so for whatever the reason, as I say, the Wall Street Journal is right. There is bipartisan support for that. It's not unanimous. And I believe as of now, Republicans who would have opposed that are pretty much gone from that party. They've been expelled or they left. In our side, we have Ed Markey. Actually, he can usually round up about 10 or 11 senators in support of no first use, any ICBMs, no small yield nuclear weapons. He writes letters from the Senate, and he gets even Dianne Feinstein, a little to my surprise. She gets on those along with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and 7 or 8 others. And I'm laughing because at one point in lobbying circles in Washington, I said, can't we get beyond 11? And the answer was, no, that's it. And in the House, we have a number of people actually in the Progressive Caucus in general, led by Ro Khanna, who's had some very good moves on this, and several others. But they don't get anywhere. They get outvoted. Too many jobs, too much influence in each district that the Pentagon has carefully subcontracted to, votes, and so forth. Minot, North Dakota, which depends upon an ICBM base. I'm laughing here because I said to somebody, a congressional staff person on this, can't we find something else for the people in Minot, North Dakota to depend on, like bombers, for example? No, it's very cold there. It's hard to get people to do anything except sit in these Minuteman silos up there and, buy real estate, eat in restaurants and so forth. They help the local economy. And when I was also informed by people who know the politics on this, when somebody says in North Dakota, look, we don't have many people here and our jobs depend on this kind of thing. It's a general thing in Congress to say, well, you don't go against that. You don't go against our colleagues' political needs here in this. And so we're still getting these insane continuation of ICBMs, the trigger to the doomsday machine, the fast-acting, vulnerable missiles that have to be used or lost in the event of warning. So they are the hair trigger on the doomsday machine. Okay, now I forget, I'm sorry. I think that goes, yeah, we have a bipartisan policy here that gets to be changed. And it's my impression that even my heroes like Bernie Sanders and AOC in Congress have not focused that much on the question of the defense budget, although Bernie did call for a 10% drop. And by the way, Bernie Sanders led a move in both houses, both House and Senate, to cut off funding for Yemen, the genocidal war we're supporting the Saudis in Yemen. And they actually cut it off. And Trump vetoed it. Well, that should be up for Biden right now. I actually suspect he won't veto that, although the war is going on still at this moment. So it's up to us to put pressure on Congress to say, go back to that and cut that one off at least. We've been talking about Taiwan, but Yemen is an ongoing war there now where the civilians are suffering monstrously. It's a crime against humanity. And Democrats could cut that off.
Just to say that there are campaigns at this point to end the continuing support for that war.